We'll go through a couple more examples that are outside of the sort of specifics of the solid acronyms. These other patterns, I would say, will help us resolve object-oriented design principles or challenges, but may show up, not directly in one of the solid acronyms. So this is a super useful pattern, the null object pattern. And the idea is that we want to have some invariance in our design to simplify our implementation, but our app requirements sort of break this in some reason. I think the most common example that we can imagine for a null object pattern is something like the current user. In our Rails app, we often do things like say, is the current user present before we do some action like render the current user's name, perhaps, or we check if the current user exists before displaying some kind of message. And this suggests that if we're checking for the existence of something frequently, that we might have the need for what we call a null object, or a particular instance of a class that represents the instance of sort of nothing. So in the case of a user, a null object pattern might be a particular user instance that represents a logged out user, such that current user has no name, or it might have a name like visitor. It might have attributes like if we're talking about VIP status in our app, well, the logged out user, right, should not be a VIP because they're no one. What you decide as those particular attributes will depend on your particular use case. But the idea here is that we have one concrete object that represents the instance of nothing. And what this means is that everywhere in our application that we need to pass a user or that we need to render some data, we don't need to do things like check if this thing is nil, because we always have an instance that exists in place. This shows up in a lot of different ways. You might be booting up an app and you might need to wait for data to connect, or you might be waiting on a report to generate. So you might have a sort of report waiting or report on hold object that represents a report which does not yet exist. Null objects really simplify the design of your application. And importantly, they reduce the need to constantly check if something is nil by having a defined interface for what nothing looks like. A related sort of pattern, often because you would have only one of these null objects, is the singleton pattern, which gives us a class that we guarantee that there's only one instance of. There's a few different ways to do this in Ruby. You might start off by thinking about a global variable or a constant, but Ruby provides us a nice way of initializing an object in which we guarantee that every time we access that method, we only get one object back. And singletons are just a way of organizing functionality such that we can ensure that there's only ever one instance of that class. And they show up in a few different ways. The main thing that I'd say between all of these is about what are we trying to do with behavior. So proxies typically are going to be more directly modifying the behavior of a given interface. So in the case of Active Record, we could say sort of that like the adapter pattern allows us to connect to multiple databases, right? We have a MySQL adapter and a Postgres adapter, and it's just translating a SQL query, or I should say like a where function, into a SQL query that gets sent to the database. A proxy pattern takes that sort of SQL query and adapts the behavior a little bit more. So in practice, really what's going on is that like we've got a few of these design patterns at play in a single class. The idea of a facade in particular is mostly about simplification. And so depending on the exact tasks that you're doing, is this thing a facade or is it a proxy? It can kind of be an academic question at that point because they can be pretty similar.